So, good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome Ms. Lough from Chatham House. Thank you for being here with us today. ECHR is working currently on a series of interviews with leading experts in order to put the present crisis between Ukraine and Russia in a bigger picture. So, you are an Associate Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And you have as well gained plenty of field experience working for NATO and as well in the private sector, right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. I would like to ask you a few questions. So recently we have seen a diplomatic offensive of the UK, a lot of high-level activity concerning the current situation with Ukraine and Russia. So how would you assess the role of the UK in the present conflict?
I think my first observation is that the UK has been very active. It's seen, I think, the opportunity to try from the outside to push the other European partners towards a policy that's consistent with thinking in the United States. And you could argue that it's been reasonably effective altogether, because I'm in no doubt that the response of the United States and the other NATO partners has probably exceeded what the Russian side expected. We managed to get ourselves, after a rather hesitant start, to get ourselves reasonably well organized and to speak with a largely single voice. And that was demonstrated during the recent visits to Moscow by President Macron and this week by Chancellor Scholz.
Okay, thank you. And it directly leads us to my next question. Does the Ukrainian crisis have the potential to change the European security architecture?
Well, it most definitely does, but it depends on the outcome of the crisis. And we find that, I think, in all cases, very difficult to predict at the moment. But this is clearly putting enormous strain on the institutions that we have. We're struggling to cope. It seems that Russia is really determined to push very hard this time to see if Western countries are prepared to give ground, and I mean to give ground, figuratively speaking, on the key issue of potential Ukrainian membership of NATO. As Chancellor Scholz correctly noted this week in Moscow, this issue is not on the agenda today. There is no membership action plan for NATO. Ukraine is not likely to receive one in the near future. I mean, that's the path to entering through the open door of NATO. But NATO did make a commitment in 2008 when it said in its summit communique that Georgia and Ukraine will join NATO. No date was given, and this has sort of hung around this commitment has hung around NATO's neck since then. And Russia seems really determined to try to do something about it now, perhaps sensing that Ukraine is heading in a Western direction, and heading there at greater speed, that it's starting to create more connections, and that over time it can become interoperable with NATO in some respects. And so this seems to me to be a very deliberate effort by Russia to ensure that Ukraine cannot escape its embrace.
Okay, I see. And well, currently we can observe two different security systems, because we have, of course, NATO on one hand, and on the other hand, the EU is as well trying to establish something like common EU defense system. I think this is especially relevant since the UK left the EU. So what do you think? Can the role of NATO in this conflict strengthen or weaken the perspective of consolidating such a EU defense system?
Well, I think we've done many rounds of this issue so far in probably over the last 20 years. The role of European defence within NATO, within a NATO framework, or could it be something that's possibly a little bit more separate? It's always struck me that there was going to be, through a form of burden sharing, a greater expectation on the part of the European allies of NATO to deliver. And they, of course, are going to be the backbone of any EU effort to consolidate its, I suppose, its defense potential, for want of a better word. But I really don't see it happening at the moment because the United States is so essential to preserving the equilibrium in Europe. And the fact that when this crisis began, Europeans immediately looked to Washington to see what the reaction would be. And possibly in answer to your first question, this is where the UK played, I think, a quite useful role. One can criticize the government of Boris Johnson for a lot of things, and I would be among its critics. But on this issue of dealing with the crisis around Ukraine, I think it's spoken in very clear language. It's taken some important actions. And even if there is a terrible relationship between London and Moscow, as we saw when the British Foreign Secretary visited Moscow, the further evidence of that effort by the Russian side to humiliate her and to just claim that the UK is of no importance whatsoever. But this, the UK remains a P5 member if it's not a member of the European Union anymore. And it has proved possible to galvanize the other European countries into taking a really firm position. I'd also actually single out here the role of Finland. And for me, the statement by the Finnish president, the sort of early stage of this crisis, when he obviously Helsinki saw what Putin was heading for, which is this effort to prevent further NATO enlargement and to deprive countries of the choice of choosing the choice of allies and their ability to choose allies. And Finland has no immediate plans to join NATO, but like Sweden, it's developed a close relationship with the alliance. And the Finns were the sort of canary in the coal mine. I think they sensed what this was about, and they responded very robustly. And I think it's very important for a small country in this case to speak up. And it happens to be one that's also very respected by Russia because of its history. And is actually very careful in its dealings with Russia and chooses its words with great care. And so I think that was a sign that it wasn't just the bigger players on the European continent who were going to respond to Russia, but there were some small countries with very firm views and very clear principles that in this case, the case of Finland, was also prepared to express them.
Okay, you have as well mentioned the role of Washington. To what extent do you think do foreign policies of London and Washington converge in regards to the Ukraine conflict?
Well, I think so far we've seen a high degree of convergence. And what I found quite striking in this crisis, and this is possibly without precedent, is the extent to which the US in particular has been prepared to brief on the basis of intelligence assessments, all the time trying to stop the Russian side from gaining the strategic initiative. And the UK has been part of that. Has supported that messaging with its own input, and it sort of felt as though that there is a kind of guiding force here in NATO, that there are at least a couple of countries that are on top of the issue. They will no doubt, when we come to analyze this crisis later, we will try to work out how accurate that intelligence was. We may even know where the intelligence was coming from, but there seems to be some kind of inside track that is making the US respond in this way. I was struck when I visited Germany would have been December. That was when we had the sort of first rather bleak US assessments about what Russia was doing on the border of Ukraine, building up its military force. The US seemed to be really quite worried about what was going on. And speaking to some of my contacts in Berlin, I got this distinct impression that the Germans were alarmed by the fact that the Americans were alarmed, if you see what I mean. So a sort of sense that the US might be overreacting to the situation. But given that Washington's focus really hadn't been on Russia. It was much more on China. It sort of seemed to me at the time, if the US is getting concerned about what Russia might do, then they must be really preparing something.
Well, okay, thank you so much. I would like to ask you one last question, because we're all wondering currently how this conflict might end or in which way it might develop. But let's say Russia will not invade Ukraine, so no war will start. Do you think how will Russia be perceived, or is there any rapprochement possible between Russia and Europe, respectively NATO?
Okay, I think your question is quite interestingly formulated, because I think you are presupposing that if there is no invasion, it means there is no war. But Russia has in fact been at war with Ukraine over the last 8 years, and we, I think, have to expand our understanding of this term, war, what it really involves. It's been a low intensity conflict in terms of the shooting across the front line in Donbass. But there's been a constant effort by the Russian side to try to undermine Ukraine's position in European affairs, to give other European countries the impression that Ukraine will not be able to stand on its own 2 feet, that this Western investment in Ukraine is ill-advised. It will never work out, because Ukraine is just belongs to a kind of different world, and it's not the Western world. And so you don't have to have military intervention in this case to have an escalation of the war. The war can be escalated by other means. You can manufacture internal destabilization in Ukraine. You can attack the country using the cyber tool, which we saw this week. There are all sorts of things that can be done with disinformation. You can have continued provocation, intimidation, and I think we're going to see all those things. I personally don't believe that there is a high likelihood of a major Russian intervention, military intervention in Ukraine. But I do think that this, nevertheless, that Russia is going to keep up the pressure on Ukraine, and not just on the President Zelensky and his government, but on those countries that are supporting Ukraine and have helped Ukraine through the last 8 years. And I wouldn't underestimate what Ukraine has in fact achieved during that period. And this partly explains why President Putin is so frustrated. He feels stymied in Ukraine, because things have not worked out the way I think Moscow expected. They probably thought the Ukrainians, would start some timid reforms, the European partners would get fed up with them, the US would get distracted, and somehow Ukraine would start to drag its feet and, eventually conclude that it couldn't pursue this pro-Western model and was going to have to find an accommodation with Russia. So that hasn't worked out. And then secondly, I think that having not got much change out of President Trump, Putin was probably more optimistic that he could deal with Biden. He saw the US retreat from Afghanistan. That was quite frankly an embarrassing debacle for Western countries that invested so much effort and money there, and probably thought that he had the US on the run and there wouldn't be too much interest in him pushing hard on Ukraine. That hasn't happened. So I think we are now in a very intriguing situation that is really difficult to predict. What I would predict reliably is that Russia is going to keep up the pressure. The question is, for how long will it keep up the pressure, and to what extent might it be successful in achieving its goals? So far, Ukraine has stood firm. It hasn't allowed itself to be provoked, which is a big success. And secondly, the Western position around it has consolidated, and I think consolidated quite significantly. Moscow can now see that if there were to be an intervention, a military intervention in Ukraine, the mother of all sanctions will then arrive, and this must be causing some, I think, some reason for reflection in the Kremlin.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your point of views with us and for giving us all those interesting insights.
Okay. Thank you, Lucas. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.